Welcome, everyone. Excited to see everyone logging in. As we wait to get started, please put your name and where you're joining us from in the chat box. We'd like to see who's with us today. And we'll get started in about 2 minutes. Aloha, welcome. Please add your name to the chat box and where you're joining us from today. Say hello to all your friends. All right, we're going to get started. Welcome to the webinar it's our Preservation and Practice webinar on preservation planning and historic structures reports. So we're very excited to have an expert group of instructors today who are going to share lessons from the field and some best practices and give us a chance to look at the role of planning in preservation and how that can help steward and save historic places. So we're really excited to have everyone and looking forward to spending about 90 minutes together and having some really good examples of how this can work. So I am Kirsten Bachner. I'm the Executive Director of Historic Hawaii Foundation, which is a statewide nonprofit organization. We are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. So we're founded in 1974. Historic Hawaii Foundation is a membership-based organization, and our mission is to help people preserve Hawaii's historic places. So I'm joined by our Education Program Manager, Andrea Nandoskar, and our Development Manager, Michelle Kizik, who are providing technical support and will be helping to monitor the chat and helping with some of the moderation for comments. Our Preservation and Practice series is a partnership with the National Park Service, and we've been so appreciative of the partnership we have with NPS. Besides managing the nation's parks, monuments, memorials, and trails, they also have a preservation partnerships program that helps communities learn how to preserve and steward historic places. So we're very appreciative of Michael Miller, who's going to be our expert speaker with us today. This time we're also working with the Hawaii State Historic Preservation Division and their archaeology branch. Megan Alvarez will be one of our presenters later on. The Hawaii State Historic Preservation Division is one of the divisions of the Department of Land and Natural Resources, and SHPD, also known as SHPD, has 3 branches. It's architecture, archaeology, history, and culture. Megan is joining us from the archaeology branch. We drew on our case study of Haena State Park on the island of Kauai with the Division of State Parks and their consultant, PBR Hawaii. We chose this case study in part because we gave it 3 historic preservation awards to illustrate really how outstanding and exemplary this plan was. We provided an award for the plan itself, as well as for some of the implementing projects. So we're going to hear from Alan Carpenter and Kimmy Ewan, who will talk about that plan later on. We have continuing education credits for professional development for AICP, the American Institute of Certified Planners, through the APA Hawaii chapter. So those of you who are AICP can claim your certificate maintenance credits afterwards. And then the AIA Honolulu chapter is also offering continuing education credits for AIA members. Those of you who need AIA credits, be sure to put your name and your AIA number in the survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. We will consolidate those, submit them to AIA Honolulu, and that's how you will get credit. So you will need your name and number and add that to the survey at the end of the session. As I mentioned, I'm Kirsten Faulkner. I am the executive director and I'm your moderator today, but our expert speakers are Michael Miller, who is a Bureau Historical Architect and Program Lead with the Parks Program and National Heritage Areas for the National Park Service. And bios for all of our speakers are on our website as well as here in the slide deck. Megan Alvarez is an archaeologist with the state of Hawaii, and she conducts the historic preservation reviews that include preservation plans. So she's going to be talking about how SHPT reviews and works with stewardship groups as they develop preservation plans. I mentioned our case study will be on the Hyannis State Park. So Kimmy Ewan is Vice President of PBR Hawaii, and she was the project manager for this park and the EIS. And Alan Carpenter is the Assistant Administrator for the Hawaii State Parks Division. So Alan and Kimmy will be sharing with us later as well. We have about 90 minutes together and about 25 minutes each for each of our 3 sections, and then we will have time for questions and answers with everybody at the very end. We're going to be talking about preservation plans and how they fit into cultural resource management and preservation stewardship overall, and then how preservation plans relate to more specific technical plans. The title of this session included historic structures reports. We are going to talk about those, but not in as much depth as the preservation plans overall. And we will also mention some other planning tools and methods and where to go for resources for doing more technical assessment when you're doing these planning documents. So we'll look at the relationship between all those different documents and how they can supplement and fill in the gaps and work together. We'll look at how planning and preservation leads to property stewardship, which is ultimately our goal, is to save places. And then we'll look at both what you can focus on when you're doing this proactively, when you're affirmatively trying to plan, versus reactionary when something is happening all around you and you need to get your handle on it and try to figure out how to preserve particular sites in the face of other things happening. And then we will pull all that together with a couple of case studies. Michael will talk about a case study from Georgia, and Alan and Kimmy will talk about a case study from Kauai. We will use the chat box, so please put your questions in the chat, and when we get to the Q&A, we will be working from there. This session is being recorded. It will be posted to historichawaii.org as well as to Historic Hawaii Foundation's YouTube channel. We will also post this slide deck, so you don't have to feverishly be taking notes on all of this. We will make it available as a PDF that you can download later on. And some of our speakers have some examples and some other resources and some links. We will also add those to our website. So I think that takes us to our first speaker. So please welcome Michael Miller.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you for all of you for joining today's webinar. My name is Michael Miller, and I'll be discussing preservation planning from a macro, kind of high-level perspective, and then maybe drill down a little bit further into some of the micro or more detailed types of tools that we use in historic preservation. I think Kirsten mentions, planning, analysis, treatment, stewardship, HSRs, CLRs, some of the more technical aspects as well. I'll say that in over 30 plus years in my experience in historic preservation, I've learned one important thing, and it's similar to the old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So a little bit of upfront time and planning can have a major impact on the long-term stewardship of the historic resources that you're trying to preserve. I'll add that especially within historic districts and colleges, universities, at the local community level, no matter where you're coming from, the prospect of unexpected demolitions, or I know with colleges and universities, eminent domain, they can be fast and very severe. I've learned firsthand the hard way that if you don't have an effective plan, you're always in a reactive mode and you're always playing catch up. And if at the heart of a preservation battle, you're bound to lose if you don't have a good plan in place before you start there. So my career in historic preservation allowed me to work in a broad spectrum of arenas. First as preservation architect with the State Historic Preservation Office, worked with developers, private building owners applying the federal tax credit program. Secondly, I've worked in higher education as serving as preservation officer, working with capital planning, design, and construction of college and university type buildings. Lastly, I've worked with the General Services Administration and then also with the National Park Service, which to me is the premier agency tasked with preserving our nation's most significant cultural resources. So I'll start out my presentation focusing on some guidance from the National Park Service in terms of cultural resource management, but then I'll quickly transition into a case study at the University System of Georgia that I've already mentioned, and our efforts to implement a campus historic preservation plan, or really a preservation master plan at each of our institutions at that system. So I trust whether you work at the local level or you work for a municipality, local or state, federal government agency, that hopefully today's presentation you'll gain something to help you in your preservation planning activities. So next slide. As I mentioned, historic preservation, at least at the National Park Service, I'm going to talk a little bit about cultural resource management, CRM. There are three important legs at the National Park Service: research, planning, and stewardship. It's an iterative process where you really need to have done your research before you move into planning. You really need to make sure you have a good plan before you actually move into treatment or stewardship. So specifically, planning is the aspect we'll be looking at today. From a National Park Service perspective, planning for historic structures encompasses such diverse activities as involvement in park planning, facility design, preparation of maintenance work procedures, as well as compliance. The central purpose of all such activities is to identify ways of protecting cultural resources while achieving other management objectives. So this usually can be done best by evaluation of different alternatives. And I know at the Park Service, we look at lots of different options. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk primarily about the case study, which is at the University System of Georgia. And hopefully this will be able to transmit to what you're doing at the local level or wherever you're working at a park or a nonprofit. But back in 2005, the Campus Historic Preservation Plan guidelines were developed for the University System of Georgia. We received a grant through the Getty Foundation for their Campus Heritage Program Initiative. And these guidelines were developed to companion or go along with our master planning template, which we already had in place. But it was really meant to integrate historic preservation into all of the different planning processes of the university system, which included strategic planning, capital planning, as well as physical master planning. So the guidelines that we developed were in three particular components we wanted to make sure were included. One is the campus historic context. Secondly, the identification and evaluation of cultural resources. And then third, recommendations for treatment and use of cultural resources. Next slide. This was about a 2 or 3 year long process that we developed a pilot institution to develop the Campus Historic Preservation Plan guidelines. But there were three major goals that we had when we started out. One was to establish a future direction and vision for historic and cultural resource preservation at each of our institutions. Of course, we chose our pilot institution, but with the idea that this would be a model for other institutions as well. It would also provide a guidance to our decision makers, our facility staff, for the treatment of all the different resources. Secondly, was to inform the campus master plan by providing the historic and cultural resource information in articulating the vision for the preservation at that institution. Lastly, was to provide procedural guidelines that would help the institution meet its responsibilities in regards to compliance activities such as federal, state, and local legislation and policy. Next slide. Just a quick highlight of the university system of Georgia. I would say that at the time, which I was there for 20 years, from up through 2020, working at our colleges, universities, but it's an institution having about 345,000 students spread out over 26 colleges or universities across the state, about 9,000 acres centrally on the central campuses. Key factors that we had over 3,600 buildings, and that accounted for about 107 million gross square feet. So Georgia's a diverse state, roaming from the mountains of North Georgia to the coast. And we had colleges, both big and small, scattered across the state. Next slide. As we implemented the Campus Historic Preservation Plan, again, we wanted to use this as a pilot, as a model for the entire system. So we wanted to pick an institution that could be applicable to both the large-scale institutions such as the University of Georgia or Georgia Tech, but could also be implemented at our smaller institutions, which had small student populations of 5,000 or 10,000 students. So we chose Georgia College, which is in Milledgeville. Milledgeville is at the middle of the state. There's the former capital of Georgia, at least up through the Civil War. Next slide. All of our institutions, and specifically at Georgia College, had an increasing number of vehicles, parking issues, high demand for parking on campus. The university system experienced a high percentage of growth during the 20 years that I was there. So there was huge demand about parking. That parking basically spread out into the adjoining historic neighborhoods, which was a problem. There was continual need for growth of buildings, new construction, making sure the sites of those new buildings didn't infringe upon cultural landscapes or open green space. And then just critical design decisions about which buildings to rehabilitate, which of any the buildings that needs to be demolished. And it's specifically at Georgia College, basically maintaining the historic character there at that campus. Next slide. So we have three major goals at specifically Georgia College to incorporate historic preservation planning into the new master planning guidelines for the university system. When I say university system, again, that's not the University of Georgia, but it includes all 26 public institutions, which includes Georgia Tech, UGA, Georgia State, and a whole host of other institutions. But second goal was to implement a campus historic preservation plan at Georgia College, with the idea of it being a model across the system. And then lastly, to promote this and educate the entire system and encourage our other institutions to integrate or adopt a campus historic preservation plan. Actually, in my 20 years while there, we actually got that implemented at 20 of our 26 institutions, which I'm very proud of, that we were able to do that at all four of the major research institutions, including Georgia Tech and UGA. Next slide. So some of the challenges that probably you have, as well as we had, in implementing a campus preservation plan. Multiple campuses spread out across a diverse state, rural campuses, urban, both old and new, varying degrees of existing preservation history and data. We have multiple stakeholders that we were dealing with, administrators, and that includes college presidents, vice presidents, faculty and staff, contractors, faculty and students, but also the surrounding neighborhood constituents who live in the historic districts, many times surrounding the colleges. And lastly, funding. Of course, we had funding through the Getty Foundation, but we ultimately found funding for the other 20 plus plans that we did through local efforts in each institution. So there were lots of challenges to bring this together, but please go ahead. Next slide. This is a little bit of illustration of the process. Again, bringing many stakeholders to the table, including as many as we could. Many times the neighborhoods had advocates had just as much wanted to say in terms of their input in terms of the college presidents. There's a age-old conflict usually between colleges and universities and the surrounding neighborhoods, but we wanted to try to bridge that, so we brought everybody to the table, planning professionals, architects, planners, to the table, and dealt with three main issues. What are the cultural resources at that institution? What is the planning process? And then what is the final deliverable, or what is the planning document? Next slide. So one of the first things we tackled was what is historic on each campus. And this, to be honest, this, when you have an organization like higher education, whose mission is not preservation, it's specifically to educate students, educating the leadership about preservation is a hard thing sometimes in terms of grasping what is historic. But next slide. So we basically used the national criteria put out by the U.S. Department of Interior, National Park Service, the National Register for Historic Places. It's what we used. I'm sure most of y'all are familiar with this, but basically looking at the significance of American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering. Any of those structures or resources could be associated with events, persons, very distinctive characteristics, character-defining features, artistic values. All of those things added up. By the way, this is the old governor's mansion, 1830s Greek Revival house there, which again, most of the campus at Georgia College served as the former state capitol when Georgia up through the 1860s. Next slide. So one thing we really needed to be respectful of, that every institution had its own personality, its own history. And we wanted to make sure that when we developed the context, the history, as well as kind of the treatment options, that we respected the history of each institution. And that became clear when we looked at it, either adjoining neighborhoods or how the campus expanded over the years, to make sure that the areas that they had acquired over the years was integrated respectfully into the plan. Next slide. So the three main resources, which most of you are all familiar with, we use, first of all, it's architecture. Architecture is defined as a constructed work consciously created to serve some human activity. So as I mentioned earlier, and you can go to the next slide, there's over 3,600 buildings within the university system, of which approximately 42%, a little bit less than half of those, were 50 years old or older. A key factor in our analysis and inventory was that a huge number of our resources were built in the modern era. When I say the modern era, between 1945 and 1975. So during that 30-year period, which is mid-20th century, about a third of our buildings, which was one of the high growth areas, periods, at the university system. So we have lots of buildings, you can go to the next slide, constructed during that modern era. So these are beloved buildings, or sometimes very much hated buildings from the 1960s, but they, in terms of square footage on our campus, occupy a huge percentage. And so it was very timely as we looked towards what to do with some of these buildings, because they were aging to the point where all the systems needed to have work done on them. The roofs were needing to be replaced. The exterior envelopes needed work. So it helped define the decision with the decision makers of which buildings to let go of, and maybe which buildings that we needed to hang on to. So I think a very good outcome was the focus on mid-20th century buildings for this plan. Next slide. The second component, a resource of our planning process, is cultural landscapes. Of course, cultural landscapes, it's defined as a geographic area that reflects the work of both nature and man. These landscapes can be associated with a historic event, activity, or person, or they may exhibit other cultural aesthetic values. And as I mentioned, specifically cultural landscapes were under pressure because without the knowledge of from our administrators that some of these spaces or green spaces were important, they were really under attack for the placement of new buildings, which were many times inappropriate. And so we really needed an educational process to alert our colleagues that the spaces were really sacred and that they needed to hold on to them. There were some very tragic events at some of our institutions where they plopped very inappropriate buildings in some of the key green spaces on campuses. So next slide. Lastly, but not least, is archaeological resources. Archaeology is the scientific recovery of information about how people lived in the past based on the things they left behind at the site. So when we did our historic inventories, we focused on architecture, cultural landscapes, and archaeological resources. And depending on which institution, archaeology may have been more important than other institutions, but those were the three focus when we implemented our plan. Next slide. Just a little bit about the process. We pretty much used this model at all of our institutions as we kicked this off, but at Georgia College in Milledgeville, we typically had a kickoff meeting where we brought all the stakeholders together, at least the key stakeholders, outlined the process, talked a little bit about how that would work, identification and evaluation of cultural resources. Probably a really key thing that a lot of stakeholders, specifically administrators, wanted to see was, which buildings are determined eligible for the National Register or which ones are not eligible, which ones can we maybe rehabilitate in an effective manner, maybe which ones do we need to let go. So many times it was prioritizing the historic structures on a campus to say which ones were better candidates for maintaining and maybe which ones we needed to let go of. We had several working sessions. One thing that really strikes out in my mind is the college president at the time mentioned before our kickoff meeting, or one of the meetings with the stakeholders, is that parking would be the key topic. And she was absolutely correct. During the meeting, faculty, it was specifically targeted towards faculty. The key topic was parking. And finally, the president just piped up and said, we don't have a parking problem, we have a walking problem at Georgia College. And especially in relating to turning some of the green space, turning some of the surface parking lots back to green space. She said, basically made it clear that we're going to save the green space and that will solve the walking problem at Georgia College. Next slide. Again, each college has its own unique personality. In Georgia, each congressional district originally was set up to have a college. So that transitioned into the modern in the 1930s when the college system was created. So we were respectful of each individual college's history and how that came about. Next slide. Identification and evaluation of cultural resources in Milledgeville at Georgia College. The campus is really spread out through the downtown area, so it's interwoven amongst lots of the historic neighborhoods. And so we made plenty of plans. Next slide to we evaluate and identify the different resources on campus. We had what we call a level 1, level 2, and a level 3 survey, which level 3 was a little bit more in depth, basically to determine maybe for historic structures what kind of options were there for different treatments. Probably a multitude, 10 or 12 buildings were rehabilitated as a result of this campus preservation plan. An example is Innes Hall, which was a former residence hall that had been vacant for 20 years, was rehabilitated for the new School of the Arts that went into that building. So it was a successful rehabilitation. Next slide. Of course, all of our treatments were based on the Secretary of the Interior standards for treatment of historic properties. There were 4 basic treatments, which you may or may not be familiar with, which is preservation, maintaining what's there, restoration, basically returning the property or building to a particular point in time in its history, rehabilitation, which is kind of integrating new systems, but being respectful of the historic character, and then lastly, reconstructing a building that may have been lost in the past. So those were the treatment options that we carried forward in our plan. Next slide. Also, we were very mindful of the existing building stock and in which buildings could accommodate new uses and how to accommodate new uses without destroying the floor plan or the public spaces, public lobbies, corridors. So it was very important to assess each building individually and provide the leadership at that institution. And sometimes we had some pushback from our campus presidents about certain buildings, and politics gets involved with all of these as well. But go ahead, next slide. Kind of wrapping up this section here. Lastly is basically looking at the adjacent neighborhoods, the parking issues that entail around the campus, how pedestrians flow in and out and around. As I mentioned previously, we tried to use our campus preservation plan to direct or help guide the campus as if they were looking at expanding in certain areas, maybe which direction maybe would be more suited than others, such as, if you have a huge number of surface parking lots or non-historic buildings in one direction, that would be a better area to expand rather than directly into some adjacent historic neighborhoods. So we were very mindful to help provide our college presidents and leadership with some guidance in that regard. Next slide. At this point, I'm going to transition and talk a little bit about some of the more detailed or micro planning documents or reports that we in the preservation field use. If you're in the preservation arena, you probably familiar with most of these. Next slide. I've provided a list of many of these. I'm not going to be able to go in depth on all of these, but I did pick 3 or 4 that we might look a little bit more in depth in. HSRs, historic structures reports, and cultural landscape reports are kind of the bedrock, at least at the National Park Service, providing or giving guidance and direction for specific treatments and planning for individual historic buildings or cultural landscapes. And that remains so at the Park Service. Another useful tool is historic window surveys, whether you're doing a tax credit project or maybe even if you work for a nonprofit and you're trying to decide what to do about some of your historic structures. Windows are very important in most historic buildings. I'm going to talk a little bit later on building preservation plans. There's also building reuse studies and plans. Obviously, as-built construction documents are important. Preservation and maintenance guidelines. Historic furnishing plans are important in terms of interiors and kind of laying that out. Interpretive plans, and then at least at the National Park Service, we're starting to use something we call a historic property project documentation tool. I would call it somewhat of an abbreviated version of an HSR or CLR. But that's specific to the National Park Service. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit in depth on historic structures reports, similar to kind of a more comprehensive plan for, say, a college or university. The historic structures report is more of a detailed document that provides a comprehensive approach to maybe the understanding, maybe the interpretation, and maybe future treatment or stewardship of a historic property. So it gives our decision makers an opportunity to see how the building evolved over time, and maybe what's the best options for either restoring or rehabilitating that structure in the future. I put down a lot of bullets. I'm not going to go through all of those, but you can see it's a tool that can be used for basically developing cost estimates and potential work, scopes of work for a historic structure at Georgia Tech. They basically did a HSR for every building they were getting ready to rehabilitate or have any activity on. And lastly, you can see an HSR basically is a compilation of completed work or bibliography of archival materials on that particular structure. Next slide. Talked a little bit about historic window surveys, but specific to, I know, the tax incentive program, windows are very important. It's very important to get a good feel of which windows can be repaired, which ones maybe need to be replaced, and then if they are to be repaired, what portions of the window needs that repair work. Putting together an overall plan. This could be part of say, a historic structures report, or it could be a companion document as you're looking on what to do with windows. Next slide. The building preservation plan is somewhat unique to the General Services Administration. As I mentioned, I worked at GSA for a couple of years, and it's kind of a combination document of an HSR as well as maybe maintenance guidelines, as well as built drawings. It's kind of everything historic. They have maintained. GSA maintains lots of historic federal courthouses and federal buildings. They use the building preservation plan to basically guide the architects and planners when they're planning to rehabilitate it in terms of which spaces are the most sacred. So they've actually zoned the building to a restoration zone or rehabilitation zone, or what they call a renovation zone, which basically means you can pretty much do what you want to do, say in the basement area, where there's not as many character defining features. So this is a document used a lot by GSA and their inventory of buildings. And again, it's used for development of cost estimates and scopes of work as they plan to do major project or capital renovations on their buildings. Next slide. Building reuse studies or plans, they can accompany any number of a building preservation plan, HSR, but basically it's just the activity of going through an exercise to determine which spaces can be adaptively used for other functions without destroying the historic integrity or historic character defining features of a building. GSA did this a lot when they were either purchased a new building, or if they were getting ready to rehabilitate a major building where uses change. Again, this happened a lot at university level, not so much at NPS, but where there's a constant need for flexibility in some of the floor plans. So next slide. Getting close to the end. Just as-built documents. Basically, it's basically documenting what the building looks like as you start a project. Hopefully you have the original construction drawings, but many times buildings change over time. And having as-built really help shape the direction as you plan for how to reuse the building or how to restore the building, because many times buildings undergo both appropriate but many times inappropriate changes where floor plans, walls are knocked out, and having those documents are very important. Next slide. I think this is close to the end of my presentation, but I did want to mention also a very good tool with the General Services Administration is what they call their technical procedures. It's a whole list of procedures that can be used for scopes of work, and they're aligned with the CSI division specifications that you can integrate into your, say, scopes of work, or as you're developing a project. And Kirsten, I don't know if you can maybe click on the link or share some of those, but just scrolling through there, you can see it's related to either wallpaper, travertine, wood, applying gilded lettering to interior wood doors. There's all kinds of topics that if you're working with historic buildings, that this will be invaluable to looking up. And again, they follow, which is very good. They follow the CSI division as you're developing your specifications for a project. So This is public, so you can go on to GSA's website and just Google or put in technical procedures, and you can find those. With that, I think I've probably exhausted my period of time, and hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. But Kirsten, I'll hand it back over to you, or maybe hand it over to Megan.
Thank you, Michael. That was really helpful. I think the case studies in particular help illustrate some of the steps and some of the challenges. So thank you. And we will hold questions till the end and let everyone go through their material first. So Megan Alvarez from the Hawaii State Historic Preservation Division. Thank you, Megan.
Hopefully everyone can hear me okay.
Yep, you're good.
I have an air conditioning unit close to my desk, so. So we've heard from Michael about planning both at the macro and micro levels for architectural historic properties. And I'm going to kind of shift focus to what are designated in our categorization as archaeological historic properties, although many of them involve above ground constructions, and many architectural historic properties may have archaeological components as well. And they can span time periods from traditional Hawaiian that date well before contact with the Western powers to plantation period sites and World War II sites can all have archaeological sites or components of multifaceted sites. The reason, the kind of stakes in doing this planning, that emphasizing the ounce of prevention, is that it's twofold, really. Archaeologically, these historic properties are non-renewable resources. They, once destroyed or impacted, they can't be put back together. Humpty Dumpty can't be put back together. The fine-grained details, the spatial relationships that archaeologists look at are gone, irretrievably gone. And secondly, and probably more importantly, these are often given what's kind of an arbitrary designation and differentiation. These are often extremely culturally sensitive sites because overwhelmingly traditional Hawaiian cultural properties are considered archaeological sites. You have the cultural resources are in Hawaii and the Wahikupuna of Loi, which are taro or kalo terraces, Loko'ia, which is the Hawaiian term for the fish ponds, and heiau, which are the temple complexes. Those are the sort of biggest classes of these sites, the traditional Hawaiian sites. So the way preservation planning has been constructed for archaeological sites in Hawaii, it's trying to balance these two concerns, and increasingly, as time goes on, really giving the foreground to the traditional cultural aspects of traditional Hawaiian properties. Although the properties can also have significance, there are properties that are archaeological that can have significance to other ethnic groups in Hawaii. Next slide. That's the stakes. And this is sort of why we come to preservation planning. It can be statutory triggers. You could be doing a different project as a state agency, institution, or private individual. You could be working on a project that has nothing to do with preservation, and the review from our Hawaii Revised Statutes 6E, which covers historic preservation, could trigger a review by SHPD, and SHPD may ask for a preservation plan as part of that review and as part of the mitigation to avoid impacts or to deal with impacts to archaeological properties. And so these are the different triggers. There's triggers for state agencies, triggers for private individuals, whether it's a state or county permit. If a historic property is on the Hawaii Register, there is a category specifically for that. So anything impacting that historic property would require a review, which would necessitate preservation plan, the production of the document that's outlined in other Hawaii statutes, which are the Hawaii administrative rules, which detail exactly what the document looks like. I'll be getting into that in later slides. And Section 106, when the federal agencies are involved, either their money, their permission, or permitting or agreement to a project. Any of those things can trigger 106 review, which may lead to a request for a preservation plan. Or it can be done voluntarily. So if a stewardship group expresses interest in a particular historic property, a particular cultural resource, they will need to work with the landowners, but they may come to SHPD and work on preservation planning with the others who are involved, which is what the next slide is about. So we make sure we get everyone involved who needs to be involved, and we have successful planning. So it can be required, it can be voluntary. Next slide. These are who are involved. This is just a brief introduction, and the roles that everyone plays will be explained as I go through the process and then the product of the process. Key is that the landowner always needs to be involved. I've seen preservation planning fall apart when there was confusion or land ownership was in a kind of limbo. So if it isn't a limbo, all the previous and the future landowners need to all be engaged in. That can even be between state agencies. If it goes, between state parks and OHA or the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, you can have issues arise. So always ironing that out early is important. You'll obviously involve project proponents who may be the landowners or maybe institutions or local interest groups, might be NHOs or other ethnic, which is Native Hawaiian organizations, or other ethnic community organizations or interest groups. So they'll obviously kind of be the spearhead, but they need to work with the landowner if they aren't the landowner themselves. The local community outside of the stewardship group, ideally the stewardship group involves the local community, but there may be those who don't want to actively participate, but who need to be engaged with and consulted with, and whose knowledge base needs to be incorporated into the planning process and in that final document. Professional archaeologists are usually the ones who write the document because of their experience writing these kind of technical reports that have to meet those Hawaii administrative rule statutory standards. So they're the ones who kind of pull together all the information, but they do it in communication and under the guidance of the project proponents. And then other technical experts and cultural practitioners who may be needed to accomplish the preservation goals, which I'll discuss in subsequent slides. And then at SHPD, it can involve everyone. Archaeology branch, because of the construction of the Hawaii Administrative Rule 13277, which is the one covering archaeological preservation plans, we're the primary reviewer, but it would need to involve culture and history early on in the process. It may involve architecture branch if there's multi-component sites that have historic as well as traditional Hawaiian components. It definitely early in the process, consulting with our GIS specialist and our librarian to get information, to get as much preliminary information on that property you're looking at, to see if there's other historic properties around it, get that context, previous studies that exist within SHPD's library, which the professional archaeologists will also do, but the project proponents can kind of get a head start and contact them. So next slide. This is just to point out, it's kind of obscure sometimes finding the list of permitted archaeological firms, but it's on the SHPD website under branches, archaeology, and then in the first kind of third of the page at the bottom, you will see the list and can start trying to contact those to help steward the process along of stewardship. Next slide. When to plan? Early. Again, that ounce of prevention. As soon as a stewardship group is interested in engaging in that work with a historic property that has that traditional Hawaiian or archaeological component, contact Shifty, contact the GIS specialist and librarian to get as much of that background information. And things are organized by TMK, so have the tax map key, which is how to identify particular like property parcels. Things are organized by that at Shifty's, so have that handy, and you can give that to them, and they can help give you maps of sites and previous reports. And then contacting Shifty's ethnographer, which we'll see why to contact him. Currently, it's Noah Gomes, for advice in engaging with the local community in ethical ways and documenting that in ethical and ways that will meet the standards. Next slide. So how to plan. And before I get to the document that's the results, I wanted to kind of go through the process and lay it out in the component stages that kind of happen at the same time, but you do want to kind of want to think about things in this order because you want to know what your goals are, because your goals will affect what kind of information you need to gather from different people. And so the stewardship group or landowner, the project proponents need to start immediately engaging with the local community and stakeholders. This echoes what Michael said, I think, as the preservation goals are being developed. And what I mean by preservation goals are these italicized words, that it may be conservation, just avoiding and protecting. It could be stabilization if there's human or natural factors that are affecting the future existence of the site or it changing beyond recognition in the future. And then think about what you want, if it's that conservation, if it's restoration and reconstruction towards rehabilitation for either appropriate cultural use, which may be a more restricted access, or interpretation, which may be more widely drawn access to sites. Engage the qualified archaeologist, because these are sites that have above ground and below ground components, and the archaeologists have the toolkits for doing the really fine scale mapping of sites and doing the testing to figure out where those subsurface boundaries of sites are. And then they'll incorporate their data and analysis with the community consultation to assess site significance. And this is kind of the baseline. It's an important baseline for deciding even what, if stabilization is needed, what it looks like now, so that you can always go back to that after restoration work happens. If there's any questions or anybody in the future wants to know what was done, you have that before and after. And also, depending on what the preservation goals are, consult with the cultural practitioners who have this technical expertise in traditional skills that may be needed for restoring sites. I know I've seen especially the traditional skills of dry stone wall construction that are critical for most types of traditional Hawaiian site rehabilitation. Often that itself is part of appropriate cultural use that may be part of educational efforts. Even the restoration itself may be part of the education. And all of this gets pulled into that draft preservation plan, which I'm going to go over in the next two slides, that meets the standards set out in HAR 13277, but also is this important tool for everybody involved in the project to look at and be able to reference and know that they're on the same page. Literally, there'll be a page for people to look at, which when projects last for a long period of time and may involve different agencies as well as stewardship groups, that just maintaining the face-to-face relationships, we worry about turnover of people and want to make sure we have something to go back to and especially since it also involves people from different cultural backgrounds and in the various roles that they play, both at Shifty and outside of Shifty. Next slide. So yeah, that actual plan, which again, standards set out in HAR 277. Oh, I should also say that traditional cultural property studies may be part of that pulling together information from the community. So along with the AIS, the Archaeological Inventory Survey, you may have a traditional cultural property study, which again, contacting the Shifty ethnographer to get guidance on what that could look like is an important step. But we want to balance that with the archaeological knowledge. And the AIS also should incorporate that community consultation and knowledge. The preservation plan itself. So what is it? It's a practical thing. It's something that can be referenced when you're planning the work on the site and also on the site. If any issues come up and people don't know necessarily what to do, they can look at it. It is also a living document, and it's adaptable. So as the plan gets executed, it's realized that things will probably be that weren't thought about or thought, I would work this way, don't work that way. And it can be incrementally changed and adapted. And then maybe once enough changes have occurred on the ground on a regular basis, maybe on an annual basis, it's revisited and revised, and a new version is produced that can be held by Shifty and by the stewardship group. And it should be a thoughtful document that pulls together all of this knowledge and information, and that thinks about the implications of stewardship of sites, of preservation, both for the sites themselves and for the community, and the sort of long-term as well as short-term issues. So what the structure of that report looks like begins with an overview of the project. So you present what it is, what form of preservation the stewardship group, the project proponent, wants to enact, and make that very clear using the language of HAR 13277 that kind of expands from the language Michael brought up from the federal level. So it's either conservation as is, stabilization, rehabilitation. I put rehabilitation twice, that's not right. Restoration, reconstruction, interpretation, appropriate cultural use. And in Hawaii, we have that emphasis on appropriate cultural use and also on the significance of sites to ethnic communities, and particularly the Native Hawaiian community, as even part of our significance assessments, which isn't true on the federal level necessarily. You want to think about those impacts I was talking about. Want to think about or want to include who the groups that are involved. It might be multiple stewardship groups, the landowner, also those parties that were consulted that aren't in one of those groups. Make explicit the funding resources. And while you've given the sort of short-term intentions, also think about if there's future plans that may come up as this document evolves. Then we move on to giving an account of that consultation process. Again, consulting with the Shifty ethnographer on the best who to engage with, at least as a starting point of who to engage with, how to engage in ethical and responsible ways, and then how to document that engagement and put that all into this preservation plan document. And then the whole document needs to reflect what is said in that community consultation. The community consultation can't just be an afterthought that's like stapled onto it before it's turned into Shifty. I just saw a question pop up. So this is separate from burial sites. We have History and Culture Branch takes the lead on burial preservation. So they have burial site components of a preservation plan that turn into burial treatment plans. And so they really focus on that. And I know there's some issues between whether it's an actively used cemetery versus a historic or traditional burial area that's known but not still actively used. but there is a preservation alternative to this. This is dealing, sometimes sites that are being preserved in these plans have cemeteries in them or have known burial site components, and those are referenced and they are protected. Buffer zones are created for them, but the more specific treatment of them is dealt with in a separate burial treatment plan. So identifying the site. So then after you've documented the consultation process, you want to document and summarize what was identified in the AIS, which includes all the nice site plans that have been drawn by the archaeologists, because this is critical for creating the buffer zones. And they also document the current conditions. So you see where rockfall has occurred, and maybe they draw conclusions about what's caused that, whether it's animals in the area or humans, or erosion issues because of land use or things in the area. And that'll be important for thinking about planning against those forces in the future to try to help stabilize and possibly restore sites. So buffer zones. Buffer zones are, Michael referred to zones, and so these are the zones as applied to archaeological, both above and below ground features, that kind of designate where certain activities can happen and where they can't. So if you're planning on doing reconstruction, rehabilitation, you want to know where heavy equipment is allowed and where it absolutely is not, where excavators should not, mechanical excavators should not go, even when it comes to, vegetation removal. Where is it okay to use small power tools versus entirely handheld tools? And where should maybe nothing be done? What areas are totally off limits? And so these initially get drawn on those archaeological plans. And then as they develop into the actual interim protection measures, which is the next step, that are implemented on the ground while you're doing that rehabilitation restoration work, these buffer zones will be implemented on construction plans. We'll make sure that any construction plans have them, that pre-construction briefings bring up these buffer zones. And sometimes the buffer zones will have areas that are known to have subsurface features, and maybe archaeological monitoring happens in those places. And that will need an archaeological monitoring plan, which is followed by a report. And there's Hawaii administrative rules for the standards for those reports. Next slide. And this is really the last one for me. So I didn't want to leave time for, or no, this is an example of buffer zones from state parks. But this is the last substantive one for me. Long-term preservation measures. This is kind of the meat and potatoes of the planning document. So I don't want to give it too short shrift, but this is the stuff that we hash out with the project proponents, the stewardship groups, that all of this needs to reflect that community consultation, but while also meeting Secretary of Interior's standards, which are a little looser for archaeological sites. So we really want to draw on the community and what it has said, and that descendant and lineal and cultural descendant community. And each of these might become its own planning document. It might spin off into something larger that gets appended, and it's just summarized in the preservation plan, but exists as an appendix. And in addressing each of these lettered issues, we want to do what the second paragraph says, which is provide as much detail as possible on who's doing the work, what groups or what individuals, what methods and tools they'll be using, a timetable as best as can be understood. And again, this is a living document, so the timetable may be, it may iron itself out and become more detailed as time goes on. But at least sort of, is this going to be done? Is there a timetable for when funding will be sought? When things like the annual letter report will be produced, if site inspections happen, when those will happen, how often the site integrity and condition will be assessed, and then a system for documenting and reporting those outcomes. So even if it's just a little letter report that gets posted, so this whole project would have a HICRIS page, which is Hawaii's digital system for managing project reviews. So a preservation plan would have its own HICRIS page because the stewardship project is its own big project. And these things would be uploaded to that as they're produced. And SHPD can communicate with the site, with the stewards and the project proponents. So we would look at things like site maintenance, if there is regular site maintenance, vegetation clearance, how to clear sites, because we know that vegetation often grows into these features, above ground features. If they are to be removed, how can they be removed to cause the least damage to the site? The rule of thumb is cut, don't pull, but sometimes fungicides are used, but those may have their own implications. So that's something that really has to be thought about carefully. Litter control measures, depending on what kind of access to the site the stewards want to promote, which leads into site access. Are you promoting site access or are you restricting it? Appropriate site interpretation. This could be just an oral tradition maintained through docents. It could be actually installing signage. If it's signage, History and Culture branch of SHPD does a review to make sure that it's culturally sensitive and appropriate, which is one of the standards of the HAR. Permanent markers that aren't for interpretation, but maybe for sort of crowd control and to keep areas off limits, to mark some of those buffer zones that have been created in the planning document. And then thinking about future impacts, depending on the access you want to the site. Is that going to have impacts? Are there natural things impacting the site, like erosion, either depositing soil or removing it? Is there ocean inundation? Are there issues from animals accessing the site? And then what plans are there for stabilizing or trying to deal with some of those issues of stability and condition of the site? Monitoring site integrity is important to that. So you got to plan out how you'll do this, which may involve the archaeologists or the archaeologists training the site stewards to do this kind of detailed recording that mirrors what was done in the AIS in terms of getting that really fine recording of the way features look. And then that can be used to think about site stability and getting this integrity reported on an annual basis to SHPD, just so that record exists between us and the project proponents. And then this is not required, but if future archaeology is desired, that maybe thinking about data recovery plans, what areas that would occur in, developing data recovery plans that are archaeologically and culturally sensitive and would result in a data recovery report. But again, the archaeology is not essential for any of it. This archaeology, future archaeology, is not required, but if it is thought of, then that is it for me. I know there'll be lots of questions about this and about particular projects, but I should stop.
Thank you, Megan. No, there's so much to go over and we have, limited time to do it all, but we really appreciate your thoroughness and being able to go over what I think is really important for a lot of people.
Oh, just two things I forgot. Sorry. Site stewardship agreements. If you're working on state lands, those will be required, and possibly preservation easements and filing the preservation plan with the Bureau of Conveyances. Those are sort of not essential to the plan itself, but maybe things that spin off of it, just so people are aware of them.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Just as a reminder, we will be posting this presentation as well as all of these reference documents. So some of these Hawaii administrative rules are already on our website, and we'll be adding others as well. Ellen Carpenter from the Hawaii Division of State Parks is here to give us a case study of the Hyannis State Park Master Plan. Thank you, Ellen.
All right, mahalo, Megan, and good morning, everybody. Hey, we're on the home stretch, folks. We're now going to turn our focus to our case study, Hyannis State Park on the island of Kauai. I'm Alan Carpenter, Deputy Administrator for the Hawaii State Parks Division. I've actually filled several roles in my 33-year parks career. Prior to administrator, I served as park planner, but most of my career was spent as an archaeologist. So I like to say I know our parks from the ground down. And I wear all of these hats throughout this master planning process. The Hyannis State Park Master Plan has been lauded as a great success in mitigating the effects of over-tourism and for its extensive collaboration with community. It's not a preservation plan per se. It's an EIS and a master plan, but it is embedded with preservation principles throughout it. So in this last segment of this seminar, Kimmy, who you'll meet in a minute, and I are going to focus on some of the details of that plan and the process, and hopefully provide some inspiration and a broadened interpretation of preservation. We'd actually like to introduce this plan through a community-produced video about the Ha'ena planning process and its initial implementation. This video was produced by Joel Guy, who is one of our community partners at the Hanalei Initiative, and it's narrated by Chipper Wickman, who's the secretary of the Hui Maka'ainana o Makana, which is a community-based nonprofit who's been stewarding Ha'ena with us for decades and is now co-managing the park with us. Trust me, this is not the time to take a bathroom break. So sit back and relax for the next 5 to 6 minutes, and we'll see you in a few.
Wainiha, Ha'ena, Napali, place names from the north shore of the oldest inhabited Hawaiian island, where lohi have been tended for more than 10 centuries, where native plants and wildlife thrive, where hula was born, where the mountains rise dramatically from the sea. Blessed with stunning natural beauty, abundant resources, Kauai's North Shore has supported countless generations, and it has attracted visitors in ever-increasing numbers. By the close of the 20th century, the North Shore was no longer in balance. Too many people were loving Ha'ena and Napali to death, threatening the very qualities that make the North Shore so special. Cars everywhere, trails trampled, fisheries depleted. Hearing the cries from the Aina, the community, government, and visitor industry came together to try and solve these problems. Plans were developed to transform Ha'ena State Park and transportation on the North Shore. A new vision to manage rather than promote tourism emerged. Without dedicated funding, it was anticipated that implementation might take years, if not decades. A way forward was not clear. And then it happened. With change desperately needed, nature stepped in, and in just 24 hours, the North Shore was isolated from the rest of the island. The rain started on April 14, 2018, and fell with an intensity never before experienced in Hawaii or the United States. When the deluge stopped the next day, over 50 inches of rain had fallen. Kuhi'o Highway, the only land connection for the North Shore, was covered by more than 24 landslides. Homes were flooded, cars and crops destroyed, but thankfully, no lives were lost. For some, it was a disaster. For others, it was a blessing. For over 1 year, the highway remained closed, giving the Aina and the people a chance to breathe again. And during this year-long respite, things began to slowly recover. Turtles and monk seals found refuge on the sandy shores, no longer dominated by people and the smell of sunscreen. And neighbors helped each other recover their homes and their farms. Kids on bikes and families with strollers reclaimed the streets, once buzzing with a constant stream of cars. During this time of healing and regeneration, the vision of past plans became more than a dream. Suddenly, there was both the political will and funding to move quickly. Much of Ha'ena State Park Master Plan was implemented. A North Shore shuttle became operational. No parking zones were established, and enforcement was stepped up. New legislation supported these efforts. And now, built on the foundations laid before the rains, a new chapter has begun for Wainiha, Ha'ena, and Napali. Can we be better stewards of the North Shore's precious resources? Can we find balance and perpetuate culture? Can we welcome visitors with aloha while limiting their numbers? This new journey has just started, and only time will tell. Disaster or blessing? Perhaps the rain was both, and in its passing, an unprecedented opportunity to work together in new ways for the future. Now let us apply what we've learned to propel us forward without a disaster. This experience of community, government, and the visitor industry working together, nonprofits arising to serve, is a model for the entire state. E lau hoi mai na waa, I ke ka, I ka hoi, I ka hoi, I ke ka, pai aku, I ka aina. Everybody paddle the canoes together. Bail and paddle, paddle and bail, and the shore will be reached.
Aloha kako, Kimi Yuen. As Kirsten gets the slide deck back up, wanted to thank you all for having us again. As you heard from Chipper, we started from a place of community and all of the work that they had been doing over the years. He gave us this inspiration. Hana alau, aklau, ke aho, alaila, loa'a, ka ia, ka papa, o ka moam. Make 400 times 400 fish lines before planning to go after the fighting fish of the sea. Be well prepared for big projects, envision success, inspire others to see the goal, support the preparation of skills and resources. And so, next slide. We set off on the master plan for Ha'ena State Park with a lot of groundwork that had already started. PBR came into this project in about 2018. But prior to that, State Park had contracted with another consultant to actually start a master plan in the 90s. And they had come up with what was called the Community Preferred Plan, which laid a lot of the foundation for what became the eventually adopted Ha'ena State Park Master Plan. But they had mapped out the ancient Lo'i system, which you can see in the white lines on the site analysis plan. The red dots are the historic sites that were already mapped. At the far left, you have the sacred hula platform, Ke Ahu Alaka and Ka'ulopo'o Heiau. The dune system, you can see little red dots along the dune system, was important to preserve as well due to the iwi kupuna, or bones of our ancestors that were there. The two local in the middle, Loko Ke'e and Loko Naya, unique agricultural lo'i that had floating rafts for the kalo or taro. And then on the Malka side, right, we have wet caves, other cultural sites. So the entire site really was covered with all of these cultural and historic resources that are extremely sacred to the community. The hui, as was mentioned in the it's okay, Kirsten. The hui that was mentioned earlier had a curatorship agreement established with state parks in the 90s to restore the Lo'i system that you see. The next slide, Kirsten, is good. Which was actually, one of the 3 registered historic places that are located within the master plan park area. So, as mentioned, the Ha'ena Archaeological Complex, which is listed both on the state and national register of historic places. The highway itself, Hawaii Belt Road, is also listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And then the Malka portion that I mentioned near the Heiau and Ke'ahualaka is part of the Nepali Coast Archaeological District. which was also listed on both the National State Registers at the same time as the archaeological complex, which encompasses that Lo'i complex. The next slide. And so our master plan started with a community advisory committee. There were over 30 members as part of this advisory committee. We knew foundationally it needed to include all of the folks Chipper mentioned in his video, right? Lineal and cultural descendants, cultural experts, we had hula experts, we had fishermen, we had kupuna, right? Elders from the community as part of our advisory committee. We had business representatives from kayaking industry, from the tourism industry, and then we had community leaders, those that had been fighting for decades to preserve Haiena and the way of life on the shore. And so when we start out this master plan, we had 5 main goals. And that was 1, to recognize that the entire park is culturally significant. 2, to restore Haiena State Park as a living place, to cleanse, restore, and revive the cultural practices again. 3, involve the original families and reconnect the local community to the place. As was mentioned in the video, the locals did not want to come to the park because it was so overrun with visitors. Over 3,000 people a day on average. The key component was to really bring the community back to the park. But then all of that also had to be balanced, right, with the state's responsibility to uphold the park as a place for the public to access and to enjoy the recreational resources. The park was acquired by the state using National Park Service land and water conservation funds. And so a priority of the use of those funds is to make public recreation available. So as part of balancing the goals for the park, right, there is the requirement to provide recreation opportunities for the community and the public with preservation of the significant natural and cultural resources. It's all meant to be in balance. And so that was the foundation that we started with in developing the master plan. Next slide. And I won't go into detail on this. There is a lot that was already discussed in the video. Main thing was to preserve, right, and restore, bring back to life a lot of the natural and cultural resources at the park, protecting the dunes along the coast, creating a hula complex around Ke'ahualaka and the heiau. Because of rockfall hazards that happened during the 10-year process of this master plan, the community advisory committee said, hey, you know what, let's move people out of the danger zone of that highway that was getting overrun by cars and visitors anyway, take people out of that danger zone and push them out into the Lo'i, which then also, as part of feedback we got from the National Park Service was fantastic because it then brought the community and the public into the Lo'i to experience a lot of these amazing resources as they were being restored by the community. And so behind you is, I guess the side of my background. This is the boardwalk that was built following the 2018 rain bomb to bring people through the park, from the parking lot that you see in L that was built, through the Lo'i that was being restored by the community, the hui, and through a house ticket to the beach. So, correct, yes. And so all of these things happened, the layers upon layers that just seemed to work together, all came together in this master plan and was mentioned, blessing or, source of destruction and much needing to be rebuilt, that 2018 rain bomb created this opportunity to actually implement most of the elements of the master plan. So next slide. I'm going to turn it over now to Alan, who will go through some of the more detailed aspects of historic restoration.
Mahalo, Kimmy. Sorry. So actually, I'm going to focus my comments on what I see as the living sites of Haiena, I'll probably be more philosophical than technical, but that seems like a good way to wind this down. As you saw from the previous graphic, something like 40% of the usable area of Haena State Park is covered by lo'i, which are the irrigated pond fields formerly in taro cultivation. Ironically, the creation of the park in the 1970s put an end to perhaps 700 years of continuous agricultural use here. Lo'i systems were ubiquitous in traditional Hawaii. Taro was the staple crop that fed a kingdom. But by the turn of the last century, the fallow fields of Haena had become enveloped by jungle. This photo is not of Haena, rather of Milili'i, which is within Napali Coast. It shows what I think an archaeologist, and I have been one, would consider a beautifully preserved lo'i system. The rock walls are intact. The trees and their canopy keep the weeds at bay, which gives you a great view of the system underneath. And while this is certainly a form of preservation, these lo'i are not alive. Next slide, please. The lo'i at Haena were actually in far worse shape than those at Milili'i when this process began. The wetter environment here fostered much denser growth. Pictures would actually not show anything but trees and ground cover. The walls were not even visible. And in the late 1990s, the community approached state parks and asked us to bring the system back to life. This began not just the preservation process, but the process of enhancement. It's been a journey filled with collaboration and trust. The initial clearing was done under the guise of an archaeological inventory survey, which is, of course, a necessary step in the preservation process. Next slide, please. Over the last 2 decades, the system was transformed back from jungle into a living system, thriving as it did centuries ago. I'm convinced that the best way to preserve a lo'i system is to plant taro in it. It's also worth mentioning that bringing lo'i to production in modern times does involve adaptation and therefore impacts. For example, plastic pipes now provide the water to the system. Modern farm machinery is used to till the soil. Next slide, please. This is Kimmy's background, but also a more full view of the boardwalk. I would add that a restored system tells a much more poignant story. And it is a park after all, so we invite people in large numbers. But masses of people and features built of mud and unmortared stone are a pretty bad mix. So as Kimmy mentioned, we installed the boardwalk through the system, which provides a quality immersive experience for visitors. But boardwalks are also a great preservation tool. They both keep the people confined to a clear track and elevate them above sensitive resources on a solid surface. Next slide. And they can be used in a variety of site types. I was actually in Yosemite National Park last week and found a boardwalk that is almost a carbon copy of what we have installed at Haena, and this is to keep people out of a meadow. It can also be used to keep people focused through sensitive dunes, which can protect cultural resources, including burials. They're famous for being used for wetlands. I've also seen them used in other countries to provide a floating pathway through a partially excavated archaeological site. Next slide, please. The job of restoration is certainly not done. Of the 40% of the parkland covered by lo'i, only about a quarter of that has been restored. The rest of it off to the right in this photo is still under that jungle I referred to that was there 20 years ago. And I predict, Megan, there'll be more preservation plans coming your way. Next slide, please. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the historic structures in the park. Haena was once dotted with small, humble homes of the residents and native farmers, far cry from the buildings we saw in Georgia. But these dated to the early 20th century. And of the dozen plus that were once here, only 2 remain. And they were both nearly beyond repair at the start of this process. And next slide. We were able to completely restore them to Secretary of Interior standards. And they are now kind of shining examples of the lifestyle that was once at Haena. Next slide. The Montgomery House in particular has really connected living residents to Haena's past. And trust me, it's in worse shape than it looks like there. But next slide. Again, the after, the restoration has connected people back to this place. Next slide. And a really fantastic story that emerged from this. It's connecting people from today to even earlier generations. So when we removed the floorboards during the restoration, the paved stone platform of an earlier halipili or grass house was exposed, which shows a continuity of use through time. And I think it's worth noting that this house did not get damaged by that torrential flood that basically, put several feet of water through many places. So clearly the traditional inhabitants knew the proper place to place this house to avoid that kind of impact. Next slide. So when we endeavored to restore these plantation vernacular homes, I already knew of the connection that Auntie Etta Phillips had with the Montgomery House. Here she is telling stories about the house in which she was born in 1939. This was before restoration. Next slide. And in 2021, Auntie used a skeleton key to unlock the door of the restored home that she spent her early childhood home in. That was a pretty major chicken skin moment. And since then, other families with a connection to the house have come forward. So we're learning about deeper connections and broader connections through the community through these humble homes. And we're actually about to enter into a stewardship agreement with this ohana to help preserve the house and return life to it. Next slide, yes. Finally, Haena is really not just about the preservation of structures and archaeological features. It's really about the preservation of a lifestyle. Uncle Tommy and Auntie Annie, pictured here in the lo'i, have both left us, but their legacy has been passed on. Uncle Tommy and his brother Jack were actually the last two farmers in the park area before the land was condemned for so-called recreation. But they stuck with it, and they stuck with us, and they were instrumental in the reclamation of the system and the restoration. Unfortunately, due to the time it took to get to full restoration, only Uncle Tommy lived to again eat the poi of KA. Uncle Jackie left us a little too early. So while throughout this process, we endeavored to stick to the Secretary of Interior standards as we restored these park features, I'm actually equally interested in meeting the Secretary of the Hui standards. That'd be Chipper Wickman. And by that, I mean the communities, and particularly lineal descendants' needs and desires for adaptive reuse. Those must be considered and taken into account as we plan for the future. And now Kimmy will offer some closing thoughts. Mahalo.
Yeah, and the two keiki children that you see are actually Chipper's grandsons, Kelly and Makua. So next slide. Great to see them. We just wanted to leave with another resource for community members who may out there looking to model what they're doing in restoration and community engagement and reactivation of these sites. There is a case study and handbook that was created by the Hui and the Hanalei Initiative. Both are nonprofits that were heavily involved in the restoration and reactivation of the sites at the park. And you can download their community handbook. The QR code works. And then the last slide is just a timeline of how long it took, right, from 77 when state parks had condemned the land and to where they are today. I was just a small part in this effort, but it is all, we as technicians who work with the community to get through the regulations that were all talked about earlier, but it is really the community that takes it forward and sees it through and reactivates the sites. So with that, we'll turn it back over to Kirsten.
Thank you all. These are wonderful examples of the breadth and the depth of the kind of work that can be done. When we talk about preservation planning, obviously there's a lot of things that come under that umbrella. Unfortunately, we're a little bit over time. I'm going to ask if our speakers could just stay on for an extra, 5 to 10 minutes. If anyone else has to go, that's fine. I did want to at least look at a couple of the questions if we can. And so if all of you could come back, please. And, we'll keep this pretty short. I know we promised 90 minutes and some people have already moved on, and that's okay, but we will post this recording again.
My video says that the host has stopped it, so I can't restart the video.
We'll see if Andrea can fix that. Question for Kimmy. The environment in Hawaii is very harsh for boardwalks. So is there a spec sheet or something on the design and materials that you recommend? And if so, we can also link to that from our website afterwards.
I can take that. We actually use some really unique materials that they're not straight up lumber. They are impregnated with treatments, and I think one was called Akoya and the other I forget, but yes, they were chosen specifically to deal with the harsh environment and particularly the wet environment, so we can provide the specs. Good question.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Yeah, if you can get that to us, we'll include that in the follow-up. I'm seeing some questions about the resources and the references, and again, we will provide those. I'm seeing a lot of individual questions, so I don't want to get too much into those. Sorry, I'm not able to read the chat while we're screen sharing, so I'm kind of catching up. Alan, there's a couple of questions about curatorship agreements at state parks and how those work, not just the one at Ha'ena, but just generally. Can you talk about what a curatorship agreement is and how state parks uses or doesn't use those?
Certainly. Actually, we have over 30 curator agreements, and they range from what we call an adopt a park to a more formal agreement. An adopt a park is simply somebody wants to help us take care of usually a specific feature within a park or area. They're 1-year agreements. Others can be formalized and actually go to the Board of Land and Natural Resources. They have higher sort of requirements, like you have to have liability coverage to cover the state, et cetera. But it's run through our interpretive program, and we can easily provide templates of the different types if people are interested. And we are always, of course, as one of the least staffed state park systems in the country, we are dependent on our volunteer stewards to help us manage. So we're always looking for groups to help step forward.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. All right, we're going to wrap it up. I am seeing some questions about how the continuing education works. So again, when we log off, you should get a pop-up box that asks you to evaluate both this program. And then if you are interested in getting either a certificate or entering, especially for the AIA certificate or continuing education, you'll need to enter your name and your number into the survey. But in addition to that, even if you're not AIA and not looking for those continuing education, we do want to hear from you on how these preservation and practice webinars work, if there are things that you found especially useful or that you have questions about, or if you would like some follow-up on anything. And also if you have suggestions for future trainings. We do about 4 of these a year, and we do record all of them. So you can see our playlist at the Historic Hawaii YouTube page has all of the past ones. And we will be planning for the next 12 months, which ones we will be covering in the coming year. So if there are particular topics that you would find useful, please let us know about them as we do our strategic planning for helping to support all of you as you do your preservation work. I want to thank all of our speakers, Michael, Megan, Alan, Kimmy, as well as the Historic Life Foundation staff members, and mahalo to everyone for being with us today. Aloha.